be smoldering without them. They break down stigmas, build up equity, and just say yes. Yes to good troublemaking. Yes to being empowered. Yes to fair access. Now more than ever, Weedmap says yes and stands with the fighters for change.
I'm your moderator, Shirali Patel, and I'll be hosting a conversation around understanding new cannabis laws and regulations. Today, I have with me two well-regarded fellow legal professionals, Chris Alexander and Christina Bucola, who are at the forefront of cannabis policy and legalization in the emerging states of New York and New Jersey. I'm going to ask both panelists to just give a quick intro of themselves and, if there is a mission for your company or position. And let's start with ladies first. So, Christina.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Christina Bucola, and I am an attorney in the cannabis space. My background is actually in transactional law, and at that I did fund formation and worked for a lot of private equity clients. That's how I started my career. I've also been in international tech. I started looking at cannabis as a way to treat one of my parents' advancing Parkinson's, and that led me on a journey that took me to High Times, where I was the general counsel, then to be a partner in a grow in a legal state, and relaunched my practice a couple of years ago as just completely cannabis focused with respect to providing clients with the best in transactional work based on my now 20 years experience. It's really exciting to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, we're honored. Chris?
Thanks for having me as well. My name is Chris Alexander. I currently run government relations and policy for an organization called Village. It's a multi-state cannabis company founded by Al Harrington. I started work on this issue, as many people, outraged by the discriminatory enforcement, particularly in the streets of New York City, the stop and frisk. And so, many years ago, started working to end the marijuana arrest crusade in New York. We eventually realized at the time, working for the Drug Policy Alliance, eventually realizing the need to really, the only really way to fix this problem was to remove prohibition altogether. And so, began to build the Start Smart New York campaign to end marijuana prohibition in New York. I was the architect of the campaign, and then, have been working on cannabis reform ever since. I left the advocacy world and went into government as a counsel to the New York State Senate, where I led negotiations on the issue. And now I'm working for one of the largest Black multi-state cannabis companies. And so trying to really put equity at the forefront of all that we're doing as an advocate, as a government official and lawmaker, and now as somebody working in this space. So happy to be here and share what I've learned.
That's amazing. I mean, both of you guys both mentioned social equity. And so maybe that can just be the starting point of this conversation. Can we both of you guys, can you speak to the state of social equity, maybe in New York and in general? And so obviously things have been heating up in New York with legalization bills pending, and the conversation has been heating up. And so do the bills, speak to social equity and social justice? And if not, where's the disconnect?
Do you want to start or should I?
Christina, you can start.
Yeah.
So, and I've worked with Chris, and I'm also a member of the Start Smart Committee, of which he was the architect, and that's how we initially met. So I come to this initially from an economic perspective, but also an economic justice perspective. And so when I talk about social equity, when we talk about equity, that to me means participation in the industry, either direct participation in the industry through licensing or working at a licensee in the cannabis industry, or indirectly by deriving some kind of economic benefit from the taxation to be put back into those communities that sometimes have never been invested in or sometimes have not been invested in. And for lack of a better word, we call that community reinvestment. And so I think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, in the last couple of years, we've seen the governor's bill, because there are two bills. There's one bill called the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act that was introduced into the legislature as early as 2013, and it has been introduced every year since then. And then for the last 3 years, as part of his budget, Governor Cuomo has proposed something called the Cannabis Regulation and Taxation Act. And in those last 3 years, we've actually seen him move and be a little bit more inclusive about the terms social equity and empowerment. But when you really kind of dig into the words, it's questionable how much weight they have, right? And they certainly don't measure up against the bill, the MRTA, which again has been introduced at the legislature. So it is being discussed. I don't know that any one state has done social equity perfectly or even well enough. I mean, I think that there are some shining examples, particularly the delivery license out of Massachusetts, we can discuss in a little bit, but it's being discussed. It is not well developed for me to feel like, wow, this is in step with what other states have done.
Yeah, and you brought up the point about other states, which we'll get to right after Chris, gets to share his outlook.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Christina has it, dead on the, on the head in the sense of, no state has really gotten this right. And I think, we've talked about this in the past that I think part of it is the understanding of, or really the other people's definition of the concept, of the framing of the phrase, social equity. Initially we saw states like Colorado, when they legalized, create things like felony bars to licensing, right? And so as we started to develop the concept of social equity, we pretty clearly said that does not make sense as a thing that should be incorporated in how we legalize moving forward. But what we started to learn and going, and I think each state, has gotten, I guess, closer. Well, most states have gotten closer than the last. But we've started to realize social equity itself is not a program. It's a framework. It's market design. It's got to be rooted in how you set up your state's market. And I think that that's part of the reason why we continue to see states fail, is that they look at it as a box that needs to be checked. This isn't MWBE licensing, right? This isn't guaranteeing or MWBE contracting, guaranteeing that some set aside, some little bit goes to people of color. This is about repairing harms that have been done. So we don't just want to make sure that people get licensed, we want to make sure that they can get them, they can keep them, those businesses can be successful, they can be competitive, and that we're able to really undo generations of damage that's been done by selective enforcement. And so I just, I always like to say it because I think it's really important for people to think of it as bigger than, checking a box. It's about making sure there's access to licensing, but also the training and compliance assistance that needs to be provided, the support for businesses, all of it needs to be incorporated in order for it to be a successful program. So that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Social equity is more than just the term, right? It's actual ownership, it's reinvestment in the communities that were devastated by the failed war on drugs, and so much more. And so, Christina, you mentioned so far, really no state has done it perfectly, and they haven't become a model for it. And so maybe can you guys just go over, what have other states done wrong? And is there any state that's kind of got it right, or at least trying to be on the right path?
I think this goes back to market architecture a little bit that Chris was talking about, because it's not that, to rip off an old baseball movie, it's not that, you build it and they will come, right? There's so much more to just building that. You can't just offer up, say, hey, these licenses are going to be available for this number of people. It's the involvement that goes into that. It's not just the licensing process, it's the incubation services. Some of these individuals don't know what it takes to run a company, but have, the natural wherewithal, but they need training and then it might look like services. We talk about this sometimes, it might look like grants just to pay bills, because it is incredibly expensive to operate in the cannabis industry, right? And so when you're talking about bringing individuals who, might not have had a credit history, how do you incorporate people in a capital intensive industry where they don't have access to traditional banking methods, right? That's very, very difficult. So the state needs to, or the program needs to step into the shoes and say, okay, we need to make resources available, because again, this is a capital intensive industry. But then we also look at licenses that might not be as capital intensive, right? Or that might honor certain types of market architecture that we already have in our legacy market, like a delivery license. So I think it's, I heard of this one program out of Oakland just the other day, where all they do is they help individuals who are wanting to start cannabis companies, help them build a credit history. So it really does, it's across the board, right? And we have to put as many small programs into place to enable people. So I think things are being done at the local level. The state level is hard, right? It's, again, not one size fits all. And particularly here in New York, I think it's going to be very difficult. We have one of the most expensive real estate markets in the 5 boroughs. And so it is, I am a big fan of Massachusetts delivery license. I do not make any qualms about it. I think it is a pretty comprehensive license. And now that it's licensure is open for it, I'm excited to see where that goes, because that is a way for entrepreneurs to enter the market, be they legacy participant or economic empowerment participants or social equity participants. So I'm a big fan of that one.
Yeah.
But also the local programs that provide those credit services and those incubation services and those business services.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something there. A thought that came to mind as you were, going through is, many of our audience today might not understand why this is such a central part of this movement, why it's such a central part of the campaigns to legalize, and it's because, it ends up being central to the program development because we censor in the campaign. We censor in the campaign because without the acknowledgement of the harm that's been done, it's gross to think that, we are allowing, some of these companies to go out and make, this ridiculous amount of money for a plant that folks have been, murdered for, thrown up against the wall, kids in my city, thrown up against walls, had their pockets stripped by law enforcement, saddled with a criminal record for the rest of their lives. And this was all known to our governments, to our police departments. And so it's part of it because of the fact that, without this type of acknowledgement, this would be really the greatest representation in my mind of white privilege, that they can decide today that they want to call a plant a different thing and then sell it, that will be okay. And so, that just wanted to frame that for folks who are like, well, why do we need to give so much support to these people trying to have businesses? No, this was the enforcement around this plant has been, as many folks will know, has been pretty egregious. And so I just want to say that. But in addition to that, in terms of states doing well, I think that, we've started to get closer and closer. Illinois was, a lot of folks were really optimistic about Illinois because they were very intentional about prioritizing social equity applicants in their legislation. It was a really robust piece of legislation. The challenge then came with implementation, and over the last couple of months, we've seen several lawsuits and stalls to the licensing process due to, kind of a mismanagement of the rollout of the awarding of these licenses. And so, what I would say is that, even as states continue to get closer, you still find places where we can continue to do better. And in that case, in Illinois, it was a more transparent process. And so I just wanted to flag that as a state that was closer than most in trying to do this thing right.
Yeah, and to your point about we can do better, I think part of the reason why it's so difficult, legalizing and decriminalizing is because ultimately we're dismantling a biased criminal justice system that's, been in place for decades. And so I think that's why it's so hard. And that's why social equity really is at the heart and center of this issue, because we need to be able to empower and educate those that were harmed so that they can have true ownership, because that's restorative justice, that's real social equity. And so I think we're all on the same page. And I want to take a step back and I want to focus on New York, because both of you have been heavily involved in that state. And so, I just want to understand how did the process begin, and what are the bills that are currently pending? Because Christina, you mentioned there's 2 separate bills. And so, I just want you guys to kind of go over that.
I could jump in. Yeah. So as Christina said, the legislature has their own bill. Each year, as part of the governor's budget process, he's authorized to introduce legislation that has fiscal impacts. It's called Article 7 of the Constitution that authorizes him to do so. And so the bills that he puts up, we call them Article 7 bills. He introduced his budget bill in January. The Senate and the Assembly of the New York State Legislature are currently reviewing that bill. They're going to introduce what they call a one-house resolution, where they identify which provisions in the budget they support or what they reject and what they hope to negotiate. And from that point, really, there begins pretty intensive, constant, all-day meetings where the legislative staff, and the executive staff meet to discuss every aspect of these bills. And so we call it the table. I previously sat as the lead for the Senate negotiating this bill, the governor's bill, the last 2 years. And so in each of those negotiations, there are big issues identified that are kicked up to higher members of the staff. Even some issues that the governor and the temporary president of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly need to discuss themselves. But as much is worked through on the staff level as possible. And so, for folks who, kind of don't see the sausage making, it's a bit of sausage making I'm going through right now, but it really will spell out how New York moves forward, what is done at the table, what is agreed to by staff before it goes forward for leadership and then for the entire legislature to vote on. And so there's a negotiation going on right now. This bill will likely be worked out to be included in this budget. And we just got to make sure that folks stay at the table, they stay engaged, and they continue to move forward.
Okay. Christina, do you want to comment on that?
No, how do you follow that up?
I guess, so what about, potential applicants, if obviously everybody wants to gear up and get ready for these licenses, what's the timeline look like? When do you guys expect to even see a real licensing round, and how can people start to get ready now, especially those that are already operating in the legacy market?
I think that, let's say something does pass in this year. So I think you're probably looking at regulations, of course, need to be rolled out before there is any kind of licensing programs. I think even in a super accelerated time frame, you're not going to see licenses until what year is it? I mean, it's 2021, my goodness, until very late 2022 or very early 2023. What do you think, Chris?
I mean, I think they can accelerate it. I mean, I think because I know how motivated the governor is to get this done, or as motivated as he's expressed that he is to get it done. When the governor wants to make something happen, it'll happen. I do think that there's a possibility that we see a commission, the oversight body that we've identified in this bill would be it's like a 5-person board. I do see that we can see that board seated pretty quickly. There are then timelines in the MRTA, I don't know if they're in the CRTA, about how quickly that board needs to create regulations. And so what Christina was mentioning was, after the board is seated, regulation has to be created before any of this happens. And I do think that there's a possibility that we see licenses or applications open up rather early 2022 before we come back to this budget time, but that's optimistic. So I think early 2022, if you're interested in applying, have your stuff together, make sure you built out your team, and be ready for something to roll out at that point in time. But I didn't add the last part. The budget that is being negotiated currently or soon needs to be agreed to by April 1st. So we'll know April 1st whether or not New York is going to have adult use cannabis programs starting in the near future.
Do you think that the standalone bill wouldn't be able to pass even though there is a supermajority?
I mean, the support's there. The Assembly could pass the bill, the Senate could pass the bill. It's with these things, it's not necessarily always the amount of support in the legislature. It's what is the end plan, right? The governor doesn't want to veto this bill. And so, it's just a reminder that, well, let me take a step back. There are oftentimes several issues in play at the same time, right? And so we as advocates may link to this one thing and say, this can happen in this way, and this is the path. But the legislature may have other priorities. They're focused on providing, renters assistance at this time. They're focused on COVID relief. They're focused on all these other things that they don't want to, create a fight about, cannabis when they're trying to make sure people can stay in their homes, and it may be the case that, this slips to a lower priority over under other things, or, it may be the one thing that's left, and it may be the thing that can be jostled over. But I mean, I do think that the votes are there. They could pass the bill tomorrow if they wanted to. I do think that actually it would be a good step to take for negotiation purposes. But, who's to say? The governor may be putting the pressure on the leadership and saying, let's just get it done in the budget. We'll get it done. There's no need to fight about it. and that may be enough for them to say, okay, we'll wait, and then we'll get all these other things that we want. Because remember, everybody has their own priorities.
Very interesting. And like you said, everybody indeed does have their own priorities, because we're kind of dealing with a lot of that in New Jersey. And so I just wanted to switch to the neighboring state, because Chris, I know you had some prior involvement in the state when you're with the Drug Policy Alliance. And just for our viewers, New Jersey citizens voted to amend the Constitution and legalize cannabis back on November 3rd. Yet as of today, we don't have enabling legislation. And so we're in this gray area. Arrests are still continuing at the same rate as they were in January of 2020, which is terrible. But can you give us some insights on what the issues are, and just speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know better than most people on the call. I know you're the host, so you can't say it, but no, we've seen what we see, and I just, from outside looking in, what we've seen in Jersey is really kind of a mismanagement of process. The cart getting in front of the horse. There were not full agreements on all pieces of the adult use bill that passed the legislature at the end of last year. The governor, didn't even agree with the solutions that the legislature put forward to fix that problem. And so we've seen a series of delays, and then just really a lack of communication within the legislature about how to move forward. The discrepancy, as I understand it, was around penalties for youth possession, and then there were some other technical issues. And so the legislature's tried to address it. The governor, they had problems internally with the solution they put forward, and then have advanced another solution. And I think the hold is for the governor to be okay with that final plan. And so, I mean, I think that, Jersey's process is one where, or the holding up of Jersey's process is credited to much more to a lack of communication, and a really kind of a lack of engagement with other folks that know. I know that there have been certain groups who've been active, like the ACLU in New Jersey, who've been leading the conversation, but I do think that the legislature and the sponsors have moved forward kind of without the input of a broader array of voices. And I think that's what's led to some of the holdup.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a lot of the issues right now, having the right people at the table, because, the ACLU can't do it alone.
Exactly.
Much like you mentioned, they have other issues that are pressing as well. And so, it's really difficult, but hopefully by the time we're talking next time, it'll be legal in another week or two, but who knows, because New Jersey is notorious for, delays and things like that. Christina, did you want to add anything to that before we switch over?
I mean, you're the person I called from New Jersey. So
Yeah, she's the person.
It's hilarious.
Are we right? Tell us if we're right.
Are we right?
No,
Yeah.
Chris, you're right. And, I don't want to focus that much on New Jersey, because like you went over it, well enough, and we're in a holdup right now. We voted to legalize. We have pending legislation that hasn't been seen by those that need to be shaping it. And so our regulations are yet to be formed when this incoming CRC, or Cannabis Regulatory Commission, comes into play. But for now, we're just in this waiting area, and which says a lot, because right now people's voices can be heard, right? So you can try to influence legislation because it's still pending. There's so much going on at the state level, but really we've seen some interest now with this new administration federally. And so before we get to like some of the specific bills, headlines were that, Senator Schumer, Wyden, Booker announced some plan to create federal reform. What that looks like, we don't know, but just give me your opinion on federal legalization, and, what do you think it's going to look like, and what's the timeline for that? And so we can start with Christina for this one.
So the two bills I'm looking at are the MORE Act and the SAFE Act. And so because there's been a change at the committee level, the Senate committee levels, in which these two bills have stalled out. Wyden, who is the head of the, drawing a blank, who's ahead of the Senate Finance Committee. Yes, he's part of the Finance Committee, thanks, is now the chairperson of that committee. And Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell recently released rules around how they're going to take things out of committee when they're in a tie, because of course, committees are made up of 50-50, given that that is how the Senate is split. And I could see some version of the MORE Act, because that's the closest piece of federal legalization that seems to echo and mirror these concerns around, or the just concerns around removing the criminal yoke around individuals' neck because they have cannabis convictions, and pursuing this from a justice-oriented space. So we have that piece of legislation. And then in the banking committee, we have the SAFE Act that, of course, doesn't really have any equity or justice-focused elements to it, but Sherrod Brown, who now is the head of the chairperson of that committee, has expressed an interest in having that bill up for discussion, provided that there are equity interests and expungement concerns embedded therein. So what we're seeing is there's kind of that headline here is that this is not an economic concern. I mean, there are economic elements to it, and the MORE Act would certainly deschedule cannabis, effectively leaving it up to the states to determine whether or not the individual state wanted to legalize it. But I think that there is a lot of momentum, and I'm happy to see that that momentum is really oriented towards making communities whole and undoing some of the damage done by the war on drugs.
Now, and the MORE Act passed the House in December, right? So now it hasn't yet been introduced by the Senate, correct?
What happened was it stalled out in the committee, right? And it was Chuck Grassley who was the head of the Senate Banking Committee, because that bill got kicked to to finance. And it just stalled out there, right? Because there was you need to have a majority to bring it to House floor vote. Although now, again, these new rules, if it's split or if it's going to die on the case of a committee being split, either Schumer or McConnell can bring it to the floor of the Senate. So that should be interesting. I don't know if the support is there. I think that there would need to be 60 senators to pass either bill. And I'm not sure that support is there. The version of the MORE Act that was approved by the House had some concerning adjustments to it, namely that there were individuals who were going to be excluded on account of, there being violent felons. And again, this is one of those cases where, of course, we want to release everyone who's a non-violent felon. But what does it mean to be a violent felon? Violence, as we think of it in our common parlance, is crimes against the individual. But a lot of times, under statute, under law, what is a violent crime has nothing to do against the person. So there are a whole bunch of people who would be excluded from this who really haven't committed any kind of crime that we would think of against the individual.
Yeah, and before we switch to Chris, because you mentioned both the MORE Act and the Safe Banking Act, can you quickly, just for the viewers, give like high-level bullet points of what those bills actually are?
Sure. The MORE Act would be a bill that deschedules cannabis from all of the 5 schedules, right? So under the current Controlled Substances Act, each substance is assigned a schedule 1 through 5, depending on its likelihood of abuse and whether or not there are any medicinal benefits. As most people know by this point, cannabis is on schedule 1. Under the MORE Act, it would be descheduled and treated more like tobacco and alcohol. And what that means is it's up to the individual states. But what would happen is there would be a nationwide tax revenue allocation that is put into a trust fund to go back into those, among other things, to go back into those communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs. There are also significant provisions around expungement and significant provisions around studying how licenses are allocated. Again, individual states are not mandated to adopt any kind of legalization program, but they would be permitted to do so. And under the Safe Banking Act, again, there's no, very, very different. And this has to deal with banks and their protection and whether or not they can service cannabis clients who are legal at the state level, but of course, federally illegal, whether they can service those clients without facing risks to their business, high level.
And obviously for folks listening, with the passage of the mark, you would need safe banking, so. It's
But yeah, and if you pass, I mean, a lot of those concerns drop out, right? If we had yes.
It's a workaround. Safe banking is a workaround.
Right. Right. It's a very bad patch.
Yeah. No, I would just add, I mean, I think, obviously great explanations. I would just, on just like the timing, and then I think the political will, it has not been identified as a priority of the new administration in the White House. But Senator Schumer has, who carried his own, was the Marijuana Justice Act, which he carried. The conversation that was happening recently was that he was going to be combining some provisions of his bill, working to create a more omnibus legalization bill, as the previous sponsor of the MORE Act was Senator Kamala Harris, now our vice president. And so I think there's some excitement. Obviously, the House passed the MORE Act. They had the support there. On the Senate level, I don't see the support to get those votes, but I do know that with leadership interested and invested, and obviously already carrying a bill, we can know that this will be a conversation moving forward. If I had to bet, I would say 3-4 years, but I mean that's my conservative bet. What I did want to just say is just about federal legalization was just that for this limited license state by state strategy that we've been taking is one that has really created a kind of a patchwork of rules. It's been really challenging for folks who are on the business side, but also for consumers, for patients. It's also created quite a bit of confusion. And so, I mean, I do think the fall of federal legalization will obviously make sure that people who are patients or who could be patients are getting access to medicine that could help them, which I think is really important. On the business side of things, it's hard to tell what the impact is going to be. For some people, it may be incredibly negative. For others, it may be an opportunity at expansion once they figure out how interstate commerce will work. But I think that either way, we've got to move forward beyond prohibition. The federal government needs to create some guidelines for states who have programs like our medical program in New York that's incredibly limiting and is not serving the patients of the state of New York effectively. And provide some baseline as to understanding of what equity needs to look like across the board. So I see the pros and cons of federal legalization.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I think it's going to take some time, even though everybody's really excited and talking about it. It's not a priority of the administration, and rightfully so, given the pandemic and other concerns. But Chris, maybe can you just mention the difference between what federal legalization would look like in comparison to descheduling it versus rescheduling cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act?
Yeah, so you talk to us, for folks listening, if you talk to us, we are going to say deschedule, do not reschedule. Rescheduling, for example, would be shifting cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, which means that it would be, basically treated like a pharmaceutical product, which, folks understand what that could mean. It may increase access generally, I guess, because the pharmaceutical companies are so big it can produce, but it definitely would be an incredible hamper to any attempt at creating an inclusive and equitable industry. So, we want descheduling, not rescheduling.
Yeah, Christina, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, it wouldn't protect those individuals who are finding relief under their state medical programs. It wouldn't protect state legal businesses that are actually paying not only state taxes, but federal taxes, despite being federally illegal. And, the cannabis industry employs a ton of people, and these individuals would not be protected in any regard. Maybe it would loosen up some access to research, possibly, and depending on where cannabis were to be rescheduled, potentially there might be some tax benefit. But to put it on any other schedule is to open up an entirely different and unnecessary can of worms. Like Chris said, deschedule, not reschedule. I'm going to put that on a shirt.
Yeah.
I mean, it would also, just one other point, I mean, it also wouldn't deal with entirely the legality issue, right? Like selling Schedule 2 substances is illegal, right? If you have not gotten them from a pharmacist, and it kind of shifts it into this this system that we do not want to add this plant to. So
Exactly. And like you mentioned, it would rescheduling it would mean that it remains under the purview of the FDA. Big Pharma's already heavily invested in that area, and so we don't want to go there. But why don't we end with what's your overall outlook on the direction of cannabis in 2021? Do we see the industry being diversified? Do we anticipate a heavy year of mergers and acquisitions? What are your general thoughts on what we see happening this year? And Christina, go ahead.
So I kind of had a preview to this last year. M&A is white hot, right? And that's just because access to capital amidst COVID and other concerns is not as lush as it once has been, and lending is not where it has been either. So I think that you will see more consolidations in states that have been operative for a year, 2 years, and older. I think that also on states that are coming on board, I really do believe that equity is going to take front and center consideration and justice measures, as it should, because as Chris mentioned earlier, it would be one of the greatest miscarriages of justice to form this industry and not do a look back and see that there are certain communities that have historically just been completely raised by the war on drugs, and to not make amends for that in a variety of ways it's disgusting, I believe is the word that you used, and I concur. I co-sign to that term. So those are my predictions.
Yeah. No, I see. I mean, there's going to be a lot of movement. I mean, legislatures are getting much more comfortable with doing this without the need for a ballot referendum, without the need for, I mean, they know that this is a popular thing. It's going to, provide resources to the state, and, the sky hasn't fallen in the states who've legalized and have been regulating. So, the states that are active, I mean, Virginia just passed their bill. They're still going through their consolidation process, and there's some couple of steps left there before cannabis legalized in Virginia. Maryland's discussing. Pennsylvania is on the verge. Connecticut, New York. I mean, states across the board are going to continue to start to go, and we'll start to see more states in the South start to engage in conversation. So I think it'll continue to spread. I mean, what I would just point to is Maryland a couple of years ago, when the Black Caucus stopped the licensing process, noting that there was a failure by the state to award licenses to Black companies. And I think that needs to become the model of engagement of our legislators of color as they look to these markets as they establish across the country. Look at what's happening in your state under your watch, and this handout that is being provided to folks who did not suffer the harm that was caused by the war on drugs. And so I think that's going to be the direction that we go. I don't think it's going to be smooth. I think it's going to be confrontational, and it's going to require folks to stand up and say, hold on. But I do think it'll keep going. I think the Northeast is going to go within the next year, and we'll get programs set up in the next year too. And I'm really optimistic about that.
Yeah, excellent. I'm all equally optimistic given, what we're facing, even the challenges. I have hope that now the right people are starting to speak up, and we're going to see this industry move in the right direction, because it doesn't make sense to make profit over something when people are still sitting behind bars. And I think people are talking about that a lot more. And like you mentioned, Maryland, equally in New Jersey, the Black Legislative Caucus spoke up, and that's why we have the holdup that we're seeing right now, because they don't want minors to be going to jail for something that's legalized, right? And so I appreciate both of you guys and your time. I just want to ask you both for any closing remarks and where our viewers can follow you guys on social media, if you guys are present, or on LinkedIn. Christina?
On social, I'm at CB Council. That's C like cat, B like bird, council, COUNSEL. And my closing thoughts are, if you care, get involved, learn as much as you can, and let your voice be heard.
Thank you.
Awesome. I am at, I'm only on Instagram at chrisalexander.ny. On Instagram, but I encourage everybody, if you're in New York, to get engaged in the New York campaign. Smart-ny.com is the website for that. and I do work for Village, which is Viola is the brand. Hopefully, folks have heard of it. Village is the business. So you know, support Black cannabis businesses. Go buy some Viola.
Guys, and for anybody that's following, you can also follow me on Instagram at Blaze Responsibly. If you're looking to get engaged in cannabis in New Jersey, please reach out. Both of these individuals are resources, myself included. Thank you all for your time and take care.